Good evening. Founder and president of the Armenian American lobby group Global Arm, Tim Jemal, will join the first analytical from the U.S. California. Mr. Jemal, thank you for this opportunity.
Astrid, thank you for having me here.
Let me start with a sore spot. Does the diaspora perceive that the Armenian statehood, its security and defense are the priority right now, rather than blurring this with a historic agenda?
Well, that's a good question. Let me try to answer both concurrently. So we formed Global Arm about 2 years ago with 3 objectives. And the 3 are strengthening U.S.-Armenia security relations, U.S.-Armenia economic relations, and then also to ensure that there's justice for the people of Artsakh and the people of Armenia, and that democracy and human rights are protected. And then when those laws are international laws, international humanitarian, and human rights laws are violated, that there's accountability and justice when ethnic Armenians are being persecuted, tortured, and war crimes are committed against them. So to me, answer your question, we do have a contemporary agenda that deals with strengthening Armenia's security, its territorial integrity, and its bilateral economic relations with the United States and the global community. But at the same time, we also need to hold the perpetrators, in this case, principally Azerbaijan, accountable for crimes they have committed. We have to do both.
Before we move on to the important questions that you already referred to, would you say that the rest of the diaspora and the lobby groups demonstrate the willingness to put aside petty partisan interest and work unanimously toward the interest of Armenian statehood?
Well, that's you're asking good, tough questions, and I think that's why you're having me on. But I can say that I believe that there's a large proportion of the Armenian American diaspora community, as well as the diaspora communities around the world, that are very interested in ensuring that Armenia not only survives as a nation but thrives. There's always going to be some differences within organizations who may have other agendas, but I can tell you that I believe that our agenda, which includes strengthening security, strengthening economic relations, and then justice for the people of Artsakh and the people in Armenia who have been victimized by aggression, I think that agenda is supported by a huge number of diaspora Armenians, both in the U.S. and outside of the U.S. One of the things, Astrid, about Global Arm is that we are formed by diaspora Armenians, but it's important to note that we are not connected to or funded by or in any way directed by the government of Armenia or any political party in Armenia. So to that extent, we operate agenda that's independent of those kinds of forces. But at the same time, the focus that we have, which is on the sovereignty of Hayastan, of Armenia, and the security of Armenia, and diversifying those security relationships and those economic relationships, I think those views are broadly held, and I think we're absolutely pursuing the correct agenda.
Mr. Jemal, recent tectonic shifts in the region, Iran-Israel, namely military confrontation that is still going on, Russian peacekeepers leaving the region, create extra space for the U.S. to gain foothold in Caucasus. Do you believe that the Biden administration intends to do so?
Well, let me correct you on something. I know you didn't intend it to be that way. I would not call the Russian presence peacekeepers. They were anything but peacekeepers. The Russian presence in Artsakh, in Nagorno-Karabakh, did nothing to uphold the peace, did nothing to uphold the November 2020 agreement. And in fact, it was the Russian peacekeepers, or what I say, the Russian security forces, not peacekeepers, who stepped aside and enabled the final ethnic cleansing and genocide of Nagorno-Karabakh or Artsakh.
But the
And that
question
is-
remains,
that is what-
with waning Russian influence, there is more space for growing U.S. influence. Would you say that the U.S. will fill the vacuum that Russians are creating in Caucasus?
I think the U.S. is poised to fill a vacuum that has occurred due to Armenia's pivot and to the complete security collapse of the Russian infrastructure in the South Caucasus and Armenia. So I think the U.S. is poised to play a much greater role. Those efforts are paramount to what we're currently doing in Washington, D.C., in our meetings, not only with members of Congress, but the administration, the Biden administration, and the agencies responsible for security. I think the United States is going to play a greater role. And I think we saw some of that in the April 5th summit that occurred in Brussels between the U.S. and the EU and Armenia. Although the summit was not focused on security, it was focused more on the strengthening of economic ties. Economic strengthening of ties also helps the security relationship in territorial integrity of Armenia. So they go hand in hand. Will the U.S. completely usurp the void that has been left by Russia? I don't think that's ever going to occur, but I think the diversification of security arrangements is very important. And I'm telling you that Washington is poised, and our efforts are clearly indicating that, to take up some of the void that has occurred through Russia's truly betrayal of Armenia and Artsakh.
Mr. Jemal, after the meeting you mentioned between Blinken, von der Leyen, and Pashinyan, the U.S. pledged Armenia $290 million over 4 years, which is about $72.5 million yearly, and 1/3 of what the U.S. gives to the Central African Republic. Would you not say that this indicates a lack of seriousness on the side of U.S. when it comes to the partnership with Armenia?
I think it's not enough. I think the funding commitment is inadequate. And Astrid, I agree with you on this. At the same time, I do believe there is a high likelihood that those numbers will go up over the next few months. And by the end of 2024, we will see a more meaningful commitment from the United States towards Armenia, both in terms of security, through our lobbying work. The indications that in the meetings we're having and the access we have to decision makers throughout Washington, at the State Department, at the Pentagon, other executive branch agencies in the Biden administration, and on Capitol Hill with those committees who are responsible for providing security and economic assistance and humanitarian assistance for the Artsakh refugees who were ethnically cleansed by Azerbaijan and Russia. I think the totality of those three parts, those three areas, security, economic, and humanitarian, for the Artsakh refugees, I think the numbers will go up, Astrid. But I completely agree that what's been currently proposed is inadequate, and this is why we exist as Global Arm, to take this relationship to another level, and I think it's poised to do that.
Blinken also recently stated that the U.S. shares Armenia's vision of regional future. This is an important statement. Do you see a window of capitalizing and documenting this joint vision?
I do. So let's look at what's happening. Let's take a broader look of what's happening in the region, and specifically with Azerbaijan. There's a report that was just issued by Freedom House, of a respected Washington-based group that documents freedom scores around the world. They just came out with their new 2024 Freedom Index. It's called an index. And several things really stand out to me. One, that because of Azerbaijan's genocide and ethnic cleansing in Nagorno-Karabakh, it's now one of the least free territories in the entire world. That's as a result of Azeri aggression. You have Belarus, China, Yemen, Russia, Cuba are all more free than Azerbaijan. in Belarus, imagine, you look at Alexander Lukashenko. You have to be a special kind of dictatorship to have less freedom in Azerbaijan than the people of Belarus have. At the same time, so you have in Armenia this pivot and this desire to diversify its security and economic relations. It's in essence of what's called a pivot away from this dependence on Russia. And those two issues, Armenia's pivot towards a greater relationship with the West, coupled with this complete deterioration of freedom and democracy and in Azerbaijan, and then you have the U.S. and Armenia relationship increasing at the same time. I think what's natural to come out of that, Astrid, more tangible results of that what we will see is more economic integration, more security integration, and deeper and closer ties with the U.S. and with the EU. It's inevitable, it's going to happen, and it's already happening.
Mr. Jemal, Zakharova said the West is using Armenia to inflame conflict in the region. What is the West really up to here?
Well, it's hard to say it's hard to say the West has inflamed conflict more than for example, Russia and Turkey. I mean, so, I think that, I think it's quite the contrary. I don't think the West is trying to inflame the conflict. I think that the flames of conflict have been fanned by Turkey and Azerbaijan. Aliyev, keep in mind, Ilham Aliyev has not kept a single commitment to the United States or the European Union over the last 5 or 6 years. He's violated every commitment in the 2020 agreement. Every instance when the European Union and the United States have called for ceasefire or called on Ilham Aliyev not to use violence, he's done the opposite. Right after the summit on April 5th in Brussels, you know what happened. You're in Hayastan. Aliyev attacked Armenia for 4 consecutive days. So I don't believe that the West is fanning the flames of conflict. I believe that when I speak of the West, I think we're speaking mainly of the United States and the European Union. I think they earnestly want, I think there is a desire on the part of many in the United States and in the EU that are in offices that have the ability to make these decisions, that they're seeking a closer relationship with Armenia. And I think that a key point is that for many years, from the U.S. perspective, they would not consider Armenia in a bilateral context. They'd only consider Armenia as a package with Azerbaijan. Now what we've seen is that the U.S. policy has shifted and is starting to consider Armenia as an entity unto itself. So they're starting to move on this bilateral relationship as opposed to holding the relationship hostage to what might happen between Armenia and Azerbaijan, for example, in a peace deal that Aliyev has shown no interest in pursuing.
Mr. Jemal, the Center for Truth and Justice filed a call on ICC to address the ongoing genocidal intentions of Azerbaijan. Would you comment, please?
Sure. This was a really historic day. It's the first time since Armenia's ratification of the Rome Statute where there is an entity that has requested a preliminary investigation into the ongoing genocide being perpetrated by Azerbaijan against ethnic Armenians. I think the Center for Truth and Justice filing, which includes hundreds of pages of documental of evidence recorded by CFTJ in their interviews with ethnic Armenians, POWs, that details a harrowing case of genocide, torture, war crimes, mistreatment by Azerbaijan against ethnic Armenians since May 12th of 2021. And I have a clip of it, an excerpt of it. The real poster child for the genocide against ethnic Armenians in this filing by CFTJ and ICC is Ilham Aliyev himself. Let's not forget what he has recently said just last year in 2023. Quote, the ethnic Armenians should not forget where the flag of Azerbaijan flies today. The Azerbaijani flag flew in Karabakh today. The Azerbaijani flag in the Zangezur Mountains, he uses the term Zangezur. The Azerbaijan flag flies in the Zangezur Mountains. Let them not forget that. Can they come close to those flags? Can that human-like creature, i.e. ethnic Armenians and his likes, approach these flags? They are afraid to even look at these flags from afar, but they should think carefully. One day they may wake up to see Azerbaijan flag above their heads. Quote, that's from Ilham Aliyev. And let me tell you the relevance of this to Washington. The U.S. State Department is about to issue their human rights report, and we're going to, of course, make the State Department aware of this filing, and I'm sure they already are aware. Two, the report by CFTJ documents the occupation of Armenian sovereign territory by Azerbaijan of some 200 kilometers. The U.S. has said repeatedly that it supports Armenia's territorial integrity. So this filing is consistent, I believe, and we believe at Global Arm, with the current U.S. policy to support Armenia's territorial integrity. And so I think the impact of this is going to propel Washington even further to consolidate efforts to sanction the Aliyev regime. There have been lots of discussions about sanctions and legislation, and I think this filing is yet another step that will move Washington in a more concrete direction to impose very steep, very harsh sanctions against the Aliyev regime. So I commend the Center for Truth and Justice for this filing today. It is significant, and I think it will have consequences for the regime in Baku, for Ilham Aliyev and all of his senior administration officials. But I also think it's going to have a very significant impact in Washington in our efforts to hold the regime accountable, while at the same time strengthening relations with Armenia. Those two things are going to happen at once, and that's where the shift is occurring in the United States right now.
Thank you for this opportunity one more time.
Thank you for having me.
Founder and president of the Armenian American lobby group Global Arm, Tim Jemal, gave an interview to the First Analytical tonight.